Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Energy Society Fourth Week event. So today we have an in-person event, but this will also be streamed online, as you can see. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box on YouTube or comment below on Facebook. We'll take them collectively at the end. So today we have Mr. Jonny Clark, who is Managing Director at ITPEnergised, a leading UK environmental and engineering consultancy. Jonny's background is in environmental and energy management, previously served as the UK Board Director for WSP Environment and Energy / First Future Energy. Jonny is passionate about the transition to net zero and in working as a trusted advisor with clients and co-professionals in the sector. Since establishing ITPEnergised in July 2013, the business has grown to 10 million pounds turnover, employing 100 people. So in this talk, Jonny will firstly introduce how their senior members founded and grew ITPEnergised, and secondly, review the projects their companies have been working on, and thirdly, discuss how ITPEnergised is supporting the energy transition, and in his opinion, what are the best engineering topics to focus on for the transition. So I'll just add the slides to the screen. Okay, and then Jonny, introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all, and to those that have joined online. So, yeah, I'm going to give a bit of a background to what we do as a business, and really that's just. I've looked at some of the other topics that you guys cover as part of the Energy Society, which is phenomenally interesting. Quite keep coming along to some of them. This is not going to be a particularly technical or technological presentation. Always like a bit of interaction as well, so we'll definitely try and have time for plenty of questions at the end, and I'll be hanging around later. Also, if anybody wants to ask some questions offline. But this is really about giving you a bit of context as to some of the things that I guess we're seeing as a business in the sector or in the sectors that we operate in. So that's just to give you some context. So what are we about? I always start this with the why, which I think is hugely important, and everybody in our business is hugely passionate about that energy transition now. How you want to define that energy transition is perhaps a good question, one we can come back to. But I guess I've been working in the sector for getting on for 30 years, which I know will be a surprise to you. But I've been doing this a long time, and certainly what I've seen is massive change over that period of time. And if anything, I can just see that accelerating based on what we can see going on in the world around us. Yeah, and what we do is we provide technical advice, and what that means I'll come on to in a moment, because it covers a pretty broad range of technical disciplines, and I'll put some flesh on the bones on that and give some case studies. In terms of who we are, we're a technical consultancy based in the UK, but working globally. So as you can see on the slide, even though we're not that old as a business, we've worked in about 150 countries, which I still find quite hard to believe. But it really does just kind of stress the global nature of what's going on in terms of that transition. So, and you have to switch the news on these days to see that. Of course, there are various drivers for that, and there's certainly many challenges around it, which again we'll talk a little bit about later on. So most of the team that I work with are based in the UK, but we have got quite a few people dotted around the planet, and that's one of the great things about the way of working now. We could be working with the guys in Buenos Aires, guys in mainland Europe. We've got sister companies in India and Australia. Something that 20 years ago would have been really, really difficult to do, we can just do at the click of a button now. So all of that kind of interaction and collaboration, which is a huge part of what we do. I really struggle to think of any project that we work on that doesn't involve a huge amount of collaboration, both within our business and also with our clients and co-professionals that we work with. So I'll not go through what we do just yet, because I've got another slide on that in a second. So the background to the business, as I said, we started trading in 2013 and set up a very small consultancy initially, very much focused on front-end planning and consenting support to renewable projects, particularly wind and solar, and particularly in the UK. And actually, from a wind perspective, you'll not be surprised to hear that a lot of that was and still is in Scotland. For those of you that live in Scotland, you know how windy it is. So that's kind of where we started out, but obviously from a business perspective, providing pretty much one service to pretty much one sector is not hugely resilient. So from a strategic point of view, the plan has always been to diversify the kind of technologies that we work in, the services that we provide into those technologies, and also the geographies that we're working in as well. So all of that improved resilience from a business perspective, but all the while supporting that energy transition that, as we said earlier, is kind of gathering momentum. As part of that diversification, we've mainly grown organically. In other words, we've gone out and recruited people, but we've also made a couple of acquisitions, one of which Paul, who's here tonight, supported us with. And those acquisitions were strategic in that they got us into either new markets or new services, and were really important sort of stepping stones in terms of the development of the business, being able to do more things for more people in more markets, and are really exciting from a business perspective. From my personal perspective, we're really exciting things to do. And so I sort of give you a bit of background on those. Since then, we've continued to grow organically, and a big part of that diversification in recent years has been trying to support our clients and support that transition both at a strategic level. So, for example, advising corporates around their environmental social governance strategies, their energy, advising governments around their energy policy strategy, and then through implementation of projects that cascade out of that. And again, you'll see in a minute a couple of case studies where that's exactly what's happened. And we were talking just before start of the presentation that there are assets that we've been involved with for over a decade. You can go back to previous working life that are only now just starting to get built. You know, it's quite a long life cycle, even to get an asset up to a point where it's operational. And then, of course, they operate for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what kind of infrastructure they are. So it's a real kind of long time span. From a commercial perspective, what we've been trying to do in recent years is provide support through more of that rather than just the front end. For obvious resilience reasons, you're working on an asset that's going to be operating for 30 years as opposed to doing the front end for a few years. And that's where we are now, really. In terms of what we do, this is getting a harder and harder diagram to kind of present, if I'm honest, in a good way, because the theory behind this is that it's a sort of a full life cycle, but depending on which service it is that we're talking about, they are more relevant during certain phases of an asset life cycle. So I won't go into them in a huge amount of detail. I'm going to give a couple of examples of some of them, in real life. What does that actually mean? Technical due diligence. What does that actually mean? Asset management. And as I say, that will hopefully give you a bit more flavour. That gives you an idea of the kind of range of services that we do. Who do we do it for? Well, a real diverse bunch of clients. So you can see on this slide that they include people who are project developers, utilities, increasingly private equity and finance, because those assets are changing hands and increasingly sitting in funds, pension funds, for example. You can see that there are corporates and industrials on there. I mean, there are hundreds of clients. I just put up a selection, right, so you could get a feel for the kind of diversity. There's some government agencies on there you'll see as well. So and you know, and the banks. So as well as private equity, there's some debt and multilaterals, you know, donor agencies, particularly in emerging markets, which again I'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, incredibly diverse bunch of clients, and what's always been really important to us, and one of the things that we're really passionate about, is developing relationships with people. That relationships that you develop through your working careers will last more than right the way through those working careers. And going back to what I was saying about collaboration being so important, you know, these are people that we've worked with, many of them for many years, some of them in other organisations, and then they've moved to these organisations. Those relationships are super important. And the reason why we've worked in so many international jurisdictions is not because we've got people based there, it's because the relationships we've got with these guys, when they've been moving their capital, their development opportunities into those markets, we've supported them with that. Whether it be Taiwan, China, Mongolia, Oman, the US, the Caribbean, West Africa, some places that I never even heard of until we were asked to provide support there. So yeah, really exciting. The other thing that I'll just point out on this slide before we move on is you might have noticed there's quite a few energy companies, or what historically might have referred to as oil and gas companies, and most of what we're doing for oil and gas companies is very much supporting that transition and increasingly supporting them on renewable asset investment and development, which again is something maybe we'll come back to. But that is a huge transition that's going on at the moment. The investment that's coming into the sectors that we work in from what you would have recognised traditionally as oil and gas companies. So just some case studies to kind of give you a bit more of an idea of what those what we do services actually mean on the ground. What are we really doing? And maybe you can then start to see how that might interface with what you guys are all doing as students and some of the stuff that you're studying at the moment and its relevance. So the first slide is around environmental social governance, and this is hugely topical because I don't know if you've seen today at COP26 the various commitments made by corporates to decarbonise, and there's huge amounts of investment that the corporates are deploying in decarbonising. The challenge is that that's not their day job. You know, many of them will not really know where to start with that. And you might have heard of the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosure, which is going to become mandatory in the UK. Well, that's all about how do those corporates decarbonise and achieve net zero. So we work with a whole bunch of clients across a really diverse range of sectors, which includes oil and gas, it includes IT, it includes telecoms, it includes renewables as well. It includes private equity, really diverse bunch of clients, supporting them in setting a strategy for decarbonising and producing an environmental and social governance strategy for them or with them. So that is a massively growing market, and the first example that you can see on the slide there, they're actually an oil and gas sector business, and we're doing ESG strategy work for more oil and gas sector businesses than we are for any other sector at the moment. because I think they can see that their access to capital is becoming constrained if they don't do this. Well, certainly constraining the lower cost of capital for them to do what they want to do is getting higher. So that's one example. Not only setting the strategy, but then how do they implement it and how do they prioritize implementing it? And of course, it's not just about carbon. I mean, it's massively about carbon if you're working oil and gas, but actually, if you think about all the kind of social impacts of the communities that they operate in, and every business operates in a community, right? So what impact, positive or negative, do they have from a social perspective as well as from an environmental perspective? And often what we find when you're speaking to clients about their ESG strategies, they're 100% focused on carbon, which is often hugely material, but they often are not thinking about all of the other impacts they have. So if you think about ESG from a sustainable development goal perspective, I don't know how many of you are aware of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, of which there are 17. It's like, well, what impact are you having around those 17 SDGs, not just around carbon and climate change? The second example is, I put that in there just because it's not just industries that you might perceive to be mucky or historically been particularly bad from a carbon emissions point of view. It equally applies to the renewable sector, because clearly there's a huge amount of stuff that goes on in the renewable sector that is reasonably carbon intensive. Whilst the assets, when they're operating, are obviously saving carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere, clearly you've got a huge amount of work that goes into manufacturing the kit, to getting the kit to site, to constructing the kit, and so a lot of renewables investment, and particularly the private equity guys that are falling under TCFD, we're supporting them with their ESG strategies as well. So that's very much at a strategic level. Onto something that's a little bit more kind of nitty gritty from an asset perspective. So this is a project we've been working on for a couple of years, and it's being developed by a joint venture, which again is incredibly common, particularly in offshore renewables because of the scale of capital investments involved. So you've got a developer called Simply Blue Energy and Total, who again, I'm sure you're all aware of Total, and they're developing this floating wind asset called Aerobus. It was a 96 megawatt floating wind asset off the Pembroke coast. And so we've been supporting them through the consenting process, environmental impact assessment, looking at the grid infrastructure associated. We also were involved in looking at the grid constraints for the Welsh Government and for the catapult, because again, as many of you around the table are probably aware, grid constraint is massive and is often very much at the front end in terms of, are these assets going to work, because they need to be grid connected, and the infrastructure that we've got was not designed and certainly not built for the kind of decentralized low carbon technology generation that we're increasingly seeing today. So loads of work around that, and then obviously getting your cables ashore. And then when you've got them ashore, it's not just an offshore asset, there's a huge amount of onshore asset associated with it. So substations, your cable runs, all of the ancillary kind of assets that go along with all of that. And then all the sort of construction and package management that's needed to actually deliver all of that. So you've got a huge amount of work in planning, permitting, and then engineering design work that goes in before you get anywhere close to a shovel going into the ground or a boat going offshore to start to install this kind of infrastructure. And as you can imagine, although they're not, there's no monopile or jacket there's a foundation within the seabed. There are moorings. So there's a whole bunch of civils associated with it, which I'm not kind of quite at that point yet, but getting in that direction. So just kind of gives you a flavour of the kind of, I mean, there's just a huge array of skill sets that are required to get one of these things consented, get it constructed, get it operational. And again, we'll maybe come back to some of that if you like during Q&A. On a slightly more sort of strategic level, we work supporting 10 of the bidders into Scotland leasing round. So again, I don't know if you're familiar, so apologies if you are, but the Crown Estate basically releases areas of the seabed and has done over a number of phases around the coast of the UK, and bidders submit a bid for taking part of that seabed and then building these assets on it, and they bid into that. So for the ScotWind leasing round, which is just gone, and we're expecting an announcement in January, we supported 10 of the bidders with basically their strategy for approaching that bidding. And there's another one coming up in terms of the Celtic Sea, and there will be others following on from round 4 offshore off the English coast. There'll be further ScotWind rounds. We've got 40 gigawatts of offshore wind to get deployed, so there's a huge amount of work to be done there. Bringing it back onshore, so what I mentioned earlier, that we're seeing a bit of a transition in terms of the ownership of assets. So traditionally they would have been developed by a utility or maybe a developer and owned and operated, but increasingly they're owned by private equity or by a fund. And when they buy those assets, and also developers exchange assets as well, but when those assets are being bought and sold, there's a huge amount of due diligence that's required, and that's from an environmental perspective, a planning perspective, an engineering perspective, a legal perspective. Huge amount of financial modelling goes into it to understand, is the asset really doing what we're expecting it to do? If it's not, why not? What are the problems? As you said, a red flag report which says these are the things that are okay, these are the things that are not okay, and what we think we need to do to address those. That all goes into the negotiations in terms of price, and occasionally, very, very rarely, but occasionally it has happened, certainly in my experience, where a bidder will then walk away from it because they've decided that they just don't want to take the risks that have been flagged. So that's that's something else that we do within the business, and again, not surprisingly, that's a growing market because there are more and more assets exchanging hands, and I'm expecting that to continue. The asset management bit is then, well, once an asset is up and running and it's operating, well, who's looking after it? So if you've worked in a developer before, a utility, there's quite often people within those businesses that do that, but then an investment house probably doesn't have people with a technical background that do that. So that's something else that we do, particularly on behalf of investor clients, is effectively look after, monitor the asset. Is it doing what it's supposed to be doing or not? And the slide at the bottom there kind of gives you some indication of what that entails. Pretty diverse. So this case study, it's not just about your traditional low carbon asset, your wind developers, your solar developers. It's increasingly corporates and industrials, as I mentioned earlier. And this particular case study, it was ultimately funded through a government initiative called the Green Distilleries Initiative, And yeah, pretty much that's what it says on the tin, looking at how to decarbonise the distilling industry. A big part of this strategically for us was hopefully we were going to get some free product, but I have to say that hasn't materialised yet. But joking aside, it's a big challenge for lots of industries how they decarbonise, and the brewing and distilling industries, not surprisingly, use quite a lot of energy, as does chems and pharma and many others. So this is just an example of one of those corporates that we've ended up working with. We're glad who are a distiller and produce very fine single malt whiskey. If you've never tried it, and yeah, we were looking at the sort of feasibility of deploying that technology on their existing assets, and still are, because they've just been successful with the second phase of the second tranche of funding for that. So now we're going into much more detailed feasibility work for it. Nice and diverse, never dull, really interesting. Going a bit further afield, I mentioned earlier some of the places that we end up working on behalf of our clients, and we've actually done quite a lot of work in the Caribbean historically. A lot of that started with kind of policy advisory for the Barbadian government, looking at what they could deploy where and how. And I think the thing that's very different about working in some of these parts of the world, and particularly island communities, is that often the grid infrastructure is non-existent, whereas here the grid infrastructure is constrained. You know, there's not a lot of capacity there, and in many of the other places we were, the grid infrastructure just isn't there at all. So so it's factoring that into the policy work and what strategies they're going to deploy. So in this particular instance, we were involved as part of a group of 6 advisors coming from all sorts of different technical capabilities in looking at the potential for ocean energy projects, and not just wind, marine renewables as well, and looking at the coast around Barbados and identifying what potentially could work for them and what definitely wouldn't work, with a view to informing their roadmap for deploying those technologies. So hugely interesting, and the slightly gutting thing about it was that some of this was during lockdown, so we weren't able to get out there to Barbados. But under normal circumstances, that we'd be out there meeting the client on the ground and doing some of the work hands-on. So if anybody fancies a trip to Barbados to do a bit of offshore wind feasibility work, there you go. Hopefully, as a result of that roadmap, we'll start to see a lot more deployment. So I thought I'd just put this up because increasingly the world is a kind of a digital virtual world that we work in, and one of the reasons why we were able to deliver that Barbados project without actually going there is because there's a huge amount of data that's available either publicly or sometimes not publicly, but we're able to access it and use that to develop models and digital twins of the assets and the environment that we're involved with. So I won't go into any of these in detail, but we've developed a suite, a platform, as we call it, of tools which fundamentally support acceleration of that net zero, that energy transition. Some of them are relatively strategic and high level. Some of them are really nitty gritty, like the TNUoS model, transmission network use of charges system, for anybody that isn't familiar with TNUoS, but basically connecting into the transmission network in the UK, or being charged as if you were, so if you're generating over 100 megawatts, you would fall under the TNUoS regime. that's a big deal when you're trying to financially model the IRR on the investment decision making on a project. So we built a model that does that, which was no mean feat. So National Grid are the only people that we know that have got on. Anyway, it just gives you an idea of the sort of opportunities out there. So if you're good at, and in fact, a lot of the guys we've got in the business who are developing these models, they come from electrical engineering background, mechanical engineering background, but they're good at writing code as well. But they understand the systems that they're trying to model. So just something to kind of think about when you're doing whatever it is you're doing and making choices about what you're doing in the future. This is definitely what we're seeing an acceleration of, and to be honest, we're trying to be at the forefront of it ourselves. So I mean, this is by no means comprehensive, but just thinking about the future from your perspective, I mean, if I was sat in your shoes now, I'd be hugely excited about the opportunities in the energy sector. I mean that in the broader sense, because hopefully what you've gleaned from what I've been saying so far is there's just an incredible diversity of opportunity within the sector. It needs pretty much every skill set that you could possibly imagine to do some of the stuff that we've been referring to. And my personal view is one of sort of cautious optimism around the future of the sector and that transition. I actually did a podcast yesterday where I used the phrase cautiously optimistic, and then Boris Johnson used it about half an hour later. So he must have seen the podcast, he must have been one of the first people to download the podcast. But anyway, I think there's a lot of positives that are clearly coming out of COP26 and previous COPs. Clearly, not all governments are participating, and not all of them with the same kind of intent. But again, looking at it over a very long period of time, these are conversations that weren't even happening 20, 30 years ago. So it's come a long way, and there's a huge amount of societal pressure from all of you guys, and as you guys move into the world of work, and you guys start investing in pension funds, and you start making decisions about where you want to put your capital, as many of us do, it's increasingly around low carbon assets, and that's why you see investors like BlackRock saying that they're withdrawing from fossil fuel related investment completely, because they're getting pressure from the people that invest into their funds. And again, announcements at COP26 today just kind of reinforce that. There's definitely a bit of a top down and bottom up. The politicians do what they do because they want to keep us happy, so we vote them back in. And the more pressure they get, the more we're likely to see that. But then they put in place regulation and legislation, which then further accelerates it, builds momentum as a sort of positive feedback, if you like. Clearly, what you do need, though, is you need all the capital to be available to make that happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. So yeah, very much that, very much that responsible investment, ethical investment is something that we're seeing gather momentum, and you can read about it very much every day in the press. Clearly, the demand is there. We're still, as a species, incredibly energy hungry, and I'm sure everybody's sitting around the phone. They've got their mobile phones and all that kit that we all have these days that need constant charging. I find a coffee shop where I get to charge my phone, otherwise I won't be getting the train back tonight. I'll be walking. So that demand is clearly still there. And as I mentioned, I think being technology enabled, the digital world is gathering momentum and accelerating a lot of what we're seeing. Not without its challenges. So again, we were having a chat just before we started about some of the skepticism of some of us around whether the politicians are really going to do what they say they're going to do. I mean, there's been previous commitments in terms of investment, which have not been met, which is always disappointing to see. And we're being told that there will be a catch up, but it clearly is a challenge. The bureaucracy associated with not just at a political level, but at a local level. So when we're trying to get assets consented, it's all well and good a central government saying we want this to happen, but then you start speaking to a planning officer and a local authority who's trying to make a decision around what is potentially a very contentious project or asset. That's not straightforward, and you still have to jump through the hoops. Right, start to go through the in that case the planning process. So there's still a lot of bureaucracy, and as I was saying earlier, we're working on assets that have only just been consented that we started working on 10 years ago. So there are challenges around that. Infrastructure I mentioned earlier, so grid infrastructure, whether it be capacity or whether it be the fact that it's just not there, or it's certainly what is there was never designed to take the kind of generating assets that now exist and will exist in the future. There's clearly challenges around balancing mechanisms and the intermittency of some of the renewable technologies, many of the renewable technologies. The good news for you guys is there's obviously more and more opportunity around batteries. We're seeing more and more activity around hydrogen in terms of that balancing. So challenges and opportunities. Point. And the other fantastic, and I probably should have put this at the end, but the other fantastic news for you guys is the supply chain is a nightmare, and we're seeing cracks appear right the way through the supply chain in terms of the opportunity to support delivery of the kind of projects and assets that I'm talking about here, and that supply chain, both in terms of kind of professional services, kind of work that we do. There's supply chain pressure around manufacturing, around availability of kit and materials. It's a real challenge for the industry at the moment. It's one that's been recognised. I'm not the first person to be saying this, but we are experiencing it on the ground right now in terms of that capacity constraint. And I suspect that the aspirations that are there, that's only going to get tougher. So from a job market point of view, touch wood, you guys, that's going to be an opportunity rather than anything else. But it is definitely a bit of a challenge. And on that, I will shut up, and I'm happy to take any questions and open a bit of a discussion.
So, anyone have questions? Thank you for such an insightful talk. I think that was very interesting. I'm sure many of you guys find it interesting as well. So, if you have any questions, please.
How would these offshore wind turbines actually be installed?
So there's a couple of ways that it can work from a process point of view. Either they're taken out offshore and then assembled offshore, or the components are taken to a nearby port and partially assembled at the port and then taken out, and then the final assembly happens when they're out. I mean, the big challenge with offshore is just think about the environment that they're in. You always, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but whenever you see a picture of an offshore wind farm, it always looks like it's really calm. But I'm sure if you Google it, you'll see like pictures of offshore wind farms during storms, and you think about what it'd be like trying to build that, or try to do the maintenance work on these offshore assets when it's blowing a hoolie and there's a massive sea running. And not only that, I mean, that's even going out and doing the survey work, so doing the geophys, doing the ecology surveys, for example. It's a pretty challenging environment to operate in, but it requires a lot of logistics and a huge amount of planning. There's a big project management aspect to delivering any of the assets that I've sort of alluded to here. There's a huge project management role, because bringing all of the diverse capabilities together is a massive challenge. Does that answer the question?
For me, they need to kind of get under the water to install some sort of foundation.
Well, so again, it depends on the system that they use. I mean, traditionally, there's kind of two main systems that are deployed. You've got a monopile where you drill a hole and you found the turbine in that hole in the seabed, or you use a jacket, which sits on the seabed, and the turbine sits on top of on the jacket. Those are fundamentally the kind of two designs that have kind of been there traditionally. Increasingly, because we're moving further offshore, it's moving towards looking at floating wind, so that where you might have a mooring system, or even there are even barges that are being developed that are kind of geostationary, or they'll basically keep the turbine in a location. But that's for dealing with really deep water where a foundation solution just would be incredibly problematic.
Did you have a question?
Yes, and on one of your first slides, you had sort of the things you're involved in, like solar and wind and oil and gas and stuff. Are you involved in nuclear stuff?
We're not doing any work in the nuclear sector at all. I mean, it's quite a niche, it's quite a specialist sort of sector, I guess. I mean, a lot of the capability around the nuclear industry that we developed in the UK in the 50s, we kind of ended up elsewhere, and it's that's maybe an answer to a different question about inertia and skill sets, and how you keep sort of skill sets in one sort of geographic area where they develop. But we don't really work in the nuclear sector, and it's deliberate. It's a pretty hard sector to get into, and what we're good at is, I don't mean to sound modest or arrogant, but what we're good at is the renewable technologies in particular. But I mean, it's clearly, you look at the plans for SMR deployment. We'll see how that goes, and clearly I think it sees cracking on finally, and very expensively, I would add.
Two questions. Firstly, you mentioned you'd say what due diligence was. Sorry, I didn't catch it if you did. And then secondly, what are some of the new markets that you've been talking about? What are some examples of those?
Cool. Yeah, no problem at all. So the due diligence is basically the process of looking at all of the technical aspects of a project or a portfolio of projects, and identifying where the risks are. And the risks might not be risks which preclude it or prevent it from operating. They're risks from a point of view of, does it do or will it do what we're expecting it to do? I'll give you an example without naming the asset, but it's in the Middle East, and it's a huge wind farm. We did the technical due diligence on that, and the biggest challenge we found there was that the port facility that they were planning to bring the turbines into, which goes back to the first question a little bit, just was not big enough to take the scale of the turbines that we're planning on deploying. So we raised that as a red flag and said, at the moment, this wind farm, you can't build it because the port is insufficient. So you either need to identify an alternative port of entry, or some work is going to need to get done at significant cost to reinforce that port and make it fit for purpose to bring those turbines in, which is what we did.
And examples of...
And then examples, in emerging markets, there's just loads of examples. So the Caribbean obviously is one. Taiwan, there's a lot of offshore wind development going on in Taiwan. In West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, we're doing a lot of work with the donor agencies looking at deployment of grids, mini grids, mini and micro grids, decentralized generation, often as part of wider infrastructure. So it'll also involve comms, it'll involve building hospitals, it'll involve education, schools and so forth. Well, where's the power come from to enable all of that to function? And we'll look at the technologies that you can deploy and how to connect them to those assets. So which is hugely rewarding and obviously pretty exciting. Paul and I was talking earlier about a project we're doing in China, which is a tidal device which we've been involved in the design of, which is currently being built and tested in the water, which is pretty exciting. We've been doing some policy work in Oman and Mongolia, which is very much what is possible and how do you go about implementing, what's the roadmap to implementing it. It's diverse. Go on. There then.
You mentioned you did some policy work. What sort of policy advice did you give to the UK? Quite a big question.
Crikey. What time's pizza coming?
It might be late, so you have lots of time.
So yeah. I think the UK actually historically has been pretty good, notwithstanding there's plenty of criticism that could be levelled at the UK government and the devolved governments as well. Some being more aspirational than others for sure. I think there hasn't always been walking the walk, and I think the challenge with all of those is that people make pretty bold statements, but then how that's actually going to be delivered is left very much to the private sector, or perception is it's always someone else's problem. And if you think about some of the announcements that are made around public investment, they sound like quite big numbers, but in the scale of developing one of these assets, they're a drop in the ocean, to pardon the pun. So how does that really mobilise the capital? Because these things cost an absolute fortune to build. A hugely challenging. You imagine spending 10 years of investment at risk to build an asset like that. It's a huge commitment, and I think one of the things that's a bit of a challenge, and certainly has been in the past, is particularly where there's a subsidy regime in place, which is absolutely essential to kickstart a lot of the technology deployment, right? That investment needs a degree of certainty. There's already an awful lot of uncertainty, even around the technical aspects of these things, let alone the financing. If you start moving the deck chairs around on subsidy support and what that looks like, and of course the big challenge is that you're making decisions here around assets that will be there for 30 or 40 years, but we have a 4-year political cycle, and maybe an 8-year political cycle, but fundamentally a political cycle that doesn't match up with the investment cycle into the energy sector. I mean, my personal view is that energy should be a cross-party committee that's somewhat dissociated. I mean, clearly, part it is inputting into government, but it's something that needs much longer time frame planning than currently exists. So I think if I had one, well, I've got a number of wishes really, but one would be just more certainty, a bit more clarity about what their intentions are around the longer term roadmap and what do they think investment needs to look like and how is that supported, because it doesn't happen without any of that. And if I was having this conversation in 2016, I would be absolutely ranting about that lack of clarity and the debt checks being moved around. It had a massive impact on our business. The decisions that were made 2015, 2016 around subsidy regimes. So I think that would certainly help. And as I said, the other thing I think would be to make energy something that's cross-party and is planned for the longer term. That would be great. And to add to that, we only do the stuff that we do because we've been able to build a skill base and a reputation for doing it off the back of this being a world-leading place. And we genuinely are. The UK has got world-leading knowledge and expertise. And to go back to my nuclear point earlier, that'll very quickly, I mean, even more so than in sort of the 50s, 60s, 70s. Now, people can go anywhere with our IP. So if the UK wants to stay very close to the forefront of being able to do this kind of stuff and then export it, you need to stay ahead of the game and not be complacent about that.
If I could check in, so like related to that, maybe like we know we have lots of engineers here, and then we promised to talk about promising engineering topics. So in your opinion, like what are the most promising like engineering topics to focus on, or like what are the ones that are like kind of underdeveloped that you encountered during the war? You think really like has like lots of potential?
Right. Well, I would say like all forms of engineering. We were talking about civils engineers, so you need the civils engineers to, for example, to design the foundations for a turbine or for an access road to get them to site. You need your electrical engineers to design how they're connecting to work out whether they can connect to the grid and where they're best connecting to the grid. You've got actually a lot of our electrical engineers, high voltage electrical engineers, come from a mechanical background and use their modelling skills that they developed as mechanical engineers. Electrical, but you need mechanical engineers to design and operate and maintain the bits of kit. So the short answer is all forms of engineering. But I mean, CFD, right? There's a huge amount of computational flow dynamics goes into modelling the layout of let's say, a wind farm, and to a lesser extent, solar array. But those engineering skill sets, wind yield analysis, physics, right? So I would say all forms of from a bit of a sort of personal and selfish perspective, high voltage electrical engineers, they're just like hen's teeth. They're really, it's more M please. Yeah. Would be good, but yeah, it's like I said, supply chain is becoming constrained, and I think will continue to be so, which has got to be good news for you guys.
Great.
What are your thoughts on hydrogen economy, and are you planning to incorporate that into your business? Yeah,
so we're already working on hydrogen with some pretty exciting stuff going on. I mean, the challenge with hydrogen, I guess, is around the sort of the financials, around economics. We're seeing that start to shift, particularly where there's a sort of mobility angle, so low carbon transport, hydrogen fleets, and that kind of thing. I don't know if you saw on the news, but the brewery at Magor in South Wales is looking at deploying a number of electrolyzers and hydrogen produced by them as part of their facilities. We were actually involved in that, and that's only recently kind of been announced, but we've been working on that for the last sort of, I guess, 18 months to 2 years. The green distilleries, there's again hydrogen there. There's again, it's been in the news. The Future Flight program looking at hydrogen in the aviation sector. And again, I've been involved in that. So the short answer is, yeah, I mean, we can really see it gathering momentum, and yeah, I'm pretty excited about it actually. But yeah, we'll see. There's the more it's deployed, fundamentally, the more the more economically viable it becomes, and the more people that are doing it, the more people then look and go, well, if those guys are doing it, then there's that first mover advantage and there's a first mover disadvantage, and you'll certainly find with a lot of corporates, they'll be looking at what has just been announced by a brewery at Magor and go, right, well, if they're doing it, maybe we should have a look at it. So I'm pretty excited about hydrogen. Certainly, we're seeing more and more opportunity around it, and some really interesting businesses springing up around hydrogen. So.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Oh, sorry.
Let's go there because you put your hand up a couple of times.
Sorry.
Not ignoring you. Just thinking he's got a really hard question. I'm definitely not going there.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have 2 questions. First is, ITPEnergised has been working a lot on governmental multinational companies such as Scottish Energy Systems. Were there cases where ITPEnergised has been working with smaller scale energy companies, and how did it work out? And my second question is, I'm doing earth sciences and I'm also quite into climate sciences. It seems ITPEnergised has a range of portfolios such as like asset management to actual engineering consultancies such as GIS was mentioned, grid systems. Which one would be your focus, more into the finance or to the engineering sectors?
Blimey. To be honest, my advice would be do what you're interested in. This is becoming more of an existential discussion, I guess. But you're going to spend your whole career, and probably working really, really hard. It's so important to do something that you're passionate about and you really, really enjoy. And actually, one thing I've found through my career is it's quite good to try different stuff, and we really encourage this within the business for people to try different things. So we've got people who do GIS, for example, but that's not what they came in the business to do. But it's just what they've found that they're really good at, and they really enjoy doing it, and they enjoy the diversity of the things that they do. And yeah, sort of from a career path point of view, there's so much out there that you could go at, and I'm kind of hoping that one of the benefits of this is that maybe it's kind of giving you a bit of insight as to how much diversity there really is, because I certainly when I was sitting where you are a little while ago, admittedly, I had no concept, and I certainly didn't plan to be doing what I'm doing now. That kind of came about through experience. So, and I know that's a pretty vague answer to your second question, but what I do think is, you should be waking up in the morning going, I'm really fired up about going to do my job, and not, oh God, I wish I hadn't done this. I wish I'd done something different. Life's too short. First question. We do work. I mean, we work for businesses, and we work with businesses of all sizes. From sort of one-man bands who are just like real niche specialists in what they do, right the way through to like huge multinationals and corporates and some of the banks and what have you. A lot of the developers are actually quite small businesses, and a lot of the investors are actually really small businesses. I mean, they might be massive, managing hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds or dollars of funds, but actually it's a pretty small group of people that are involved in doing it. So yeah, we work with businesses at all kind of scales, and actually, if I'm honest, that's one of the things I really love about it. I love that diversity. Right? It's really interesting. Increasingly as my career has gone on, I've got more and more interested about what people are doing, what their aspirations are, how they're doing it, from a corporate perspective. I find that hugely fascinating. The one area where we really don't operate is domestic scale, right? So we don't do stuff at a domestic scale. It's massively fragmented. But yeah.
Thank you.
That helps.
We'll just take one last question, and then if you have any more questions, feel free to just talk to Jonny personally. So we'll just end the big session here, and also Peter will be here very soon. So yeah. So the last question, yes.
So given that climate change is sort of global problem and that renewables are sort of geographically dependent, do you see much investment in developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing that, what you often find is that it's the donor agencies, so people like the World Bank, UNIDO, Sustainable Energy for All, these kind of guys that are in there first. European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is another one. And then what you find over time is that the private capital sort of eventually will follow them in, subject to them being comfortable about getting the return on investment and security issues and various other things. It's been quite interesting over the years having conversations with some of these guys, because they know that we do that as well. They're quite often interested to hear what it is that we're doing in those markets, because at some point those might be emerging markets that they look at taking private finance into, and that's kind of the way that it's got to happen in reality. But I mean, one of the areas that I was going to mention earlier, actually, that we've seen a lot of activities around island communities. I mentioned Barbados, but we've got a sister company in Australia who does a lot of energy system work in Southeast Asia, where thousands and thousands of island communities, and one of the things that they always say is, you kind of see the impact of climate change firsthand. Those guys are definitely seeing it in terms of sea level rise and impacting their way of life. And of course, many of them are actually reliant on fossil fuels, on diesel generators and the like for their energy supply. So deploying renewables in those places is massively game changing, and they're hugely supportive of it quite often. But again, back to my earlier point, it's usually and often needs to be part of a broader investment in infrastructure, not just around not just around energy. So I mean, there's huge potential there. Right? Happy to take any more at a later date. I'm going to be hanging around for that. I don't know if we're about to finish the finish the presentation, but no, I really enjoyed all the fantastic questions. Your odd ones, that's what we like. But thanks everybody for staying awake and participating. We like interactive. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming today, and it was a really nice session. Thank you so much, Jonny. And so next week our event will be entirely online, and will be on geothermal. And so if you want to tune in online, please do. And then the week after, you'll be in person again. So yeah, and also thank you to everyone that joined us online, and we hope to see you next time.